Hello, and welcome to episode 134 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Killorn in Napa Valley.
Didn't get a weather report stuck onto Napa Valley this time. How is it up there?
Weather's beautiful. I'm so busy, though. I haven't had time to think about it.
Yeah, you can tell through the window. Definitely in the same boat. Definitely doubly in the same boat. What has felt like a leaking boat for this past weekend, which obviously was the June LSAT and had us both absolutely buried starting first thing Friday morning and really kind of running still through now, which is a Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it for me. I was at a concert last night down in Oakland. I've got a bunch of in-laws arriving today. I'm heading out of the country on Thursday. So I feel like between the LSAT and all of that, I'm really just busy.
Yeah, you make my life look pretty simple.
It's one of those things. I don't often go places, but when I do, it's usually for a little bit here. But that's why all the in-laws are coming in, is they're going to be sticking around the house, watching the dog, and taking care of things. And then we're going to take off and head to England and kick around there for a bit.
Yeah, a bit of Portugal stuck in there too, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct. Head down to your stomping grounds in Lisbon and parts around there.
You know, I've only been there twice, I guess, so I'm not sure if they're my stomping grounds or not. Hopefully I gave you some good recommendations, though. You'll have to let me know.
2 times more than I've been, so we'll have to see how it is. But I fit it in between this LSAT podcast recording. In fact, I was going to go to another concert tonight, canceled it so I could do this, and then I'll be back just before the Crystal Mall. So it was just the timing I could make it work. But That is why things are so busy.
Well, there you go. Usually when things are this busy, the drinks that we choose tend to get simplified, mostly out of just laziness and general fatigue. I know that's the case for me. I could barely pour 2 ingredients.
So what were those ingredients that you poured?
Well, the majority ingredient is vodka. I had a bottle of Tito's, just calling my name up there, and a splash of tonic. So I've got a good old-fashioned vodka tonic in front of me.
Well, that is interesting because I also have tonic, probably more than you do because it's not a splash, it's a significant amount. But I've gone for the more British version, which is gin and tonic. I have some Hendrix floating around. And I was like, going to England, might as well throw it in there. So
inspiration.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, like I said, pretty simple drinks. Yours with gin, mine with vodka, both with tonic. You picked the song today, so you'll have to you're carrying this one on your own, man. I don't know anything about this.
You looked at this and were like, what is this song? This is actually a song called Angelica from the band Wet Leg. He's not the biggest band in the world, but one of the things that we're doing is we're going to go see Harry Styles at Wembley, and Wet Leg is the opener.
Oh, nice.
And we just used Harry Styles like 4 episodes ago, so I couldn't use him again. But my daughter was like, if we're going to be there, Harry Styles is going to be there, can we go? And I'm like, let's go do it. So actually, I'm really, really excited about that. It should be fun.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't play it off as just the daughter. I think all three of you are going to have quite a good time at Harry Styles. And I'll join that bandwagon. I'm jealous. I wish I could be there.
I'm really excited about it. Also, Wembley Stadium, historic worldwide stadium.
Yeah, it's epic.
I've seen shows at the Wembley Auditorium, which is next to it, but never in Wembley. So I think this will be really cool. And it's in England. It's going to be a great show. The crowd's going to really be into it. So I'm pretty stoked about it.
That'll be cool, man. Keep that gin and tonic train rolling. Speaking of rolling on, let's talk about the LSAT world, because there's a few things I think we need to cover. Although this should be pretty brief, right?
I think this would be very brief. Obviously, the big deal is that the June test just went off, and the only people who really will be testing when this comes out will be the makeup testers. Yeah. And they're another week away. Anybody who had a problem, what have you, they'll be taking a different version than the test that we talk about. So the June test is the big deal. The score release, as we'll mention several times, will come out on Wednesday, June 28th. I'll come back to that in a little more detail because of the way that it times out here. And that is because the August LSAT is the one that is after this. There is no test in July that is scheduled. And that August LSAT is on Friday, August 11th and 12th, but the registration closes on June 29th. So scores from this June test will come out. You will have about 36 plus hours to then make a decision on whether or not you feel like you want to take the August test. So at least there is that. And if you're taking that August test or any of the ones this fall, just keep in mind that we've got a series of free seminars that we always run. There's one coming up on the 20th of June about logical reasoning, parallel questions. There's another one on July 5th about comparative passages in reading comp. There's another one on July 19th about circular games and logic games. That'll probably be the last time we ever run that one publicly, John, for reasons I'll explain at some other point, not tonight. And then, of course, mixed into all of that is the reason that I have to come back from my trip early, which is that on June 29th, we've got a crystal ball, a full-scale one. We'll go back and cover the basics of kind of like the question counts and things like that for both the August and September LSAT. So if you're at the June mini ball, this one will be different. It'll be a more expanded version, really kind of a very useful tool just for people who are studying for this test and getting the basics of the exam kind of worked out. And then we'll still do all the same test predictions and what have you. And John, we'll come back to that because as it turned out, the first thing that I think we both got on Friday was a wave of messages saying, you predicted these tests again.
Yeah.
At least people who'd seen the topics that we'd suggested they read up on felt pretty darn good, especially about one of the sections. So come back to that later. But join us on June 29th. And if you haven't registered already, you can go to powerscore.com/free seminars. There is no cost for that. It will be public. It'll be free for that night. I think probably we'll put it up on our website and our student centers thereafter, but at least for the first night, it'll be free to everyone.
Yeah, lots of good stuff coming up. Sorry to cut your trip short, though, Dave. I know it's much appreciated by everyone else.
I blame you mostly, but, that's how it goes.
That's fair. Well, I'm not traveling, so I had to take it out on somebody.
So let's get to the June 2023 LSAT and just really kind of talk about that. And let's start off with what we saw from the number of people taking the test and kind of a breakdown overall. And John, if you don't mind, I'll just run through this and kind of cover it for you.
That's all you.
So we had the test start on Friday, and as it turned out, there were about 8,200 people and change who ended up taking this test on Friday. There were more scheduled, of course, but there's always this melt away that occurs on the day of the test, the day before the test, and really in the weeks since the point of registration. This exam came down from over 27,000 people, and it'll ultimately end up being around 17 to 17,500. It's a huge melt on June. On Saturday, about 8,000 people tested. And if you follow me on Twitter, you probably noticed that throughout the day I would post how many people had started the test, how many people had completed it, which is information that is just kind of helpful to see how the test flow is going. Usually comment about whether there were any problems. One of the nice things about this exam was nothing major seemed to happen from a ProctorU standpoint. So that's always very welcome.
Yeah.
There are always problems. Again, we're not downplaying the fact that some people had issues and ended up having to be retaking the test, but there was no systemic issue where there were hundreds or thousands of people affected by an outage.
Yeah.
All right, so through the weekend, Friday and Saturday, you have about 16,200 people take this test. And then today, Tuesday, because we're recording this, as you noted, in the late afternoon, you had about 900 international test takers and about 225 paper and pencil test takers. So you end up with about 17,335 or so test takers. That will end up being about the final number. And there will be some makeups in there, but they're not coming up for another week or so. So we'll be talking about the international test, the paper and pencil test, and the domestic administration here as we kind of cover the topics, what was real, what was not real. But we won't be talking about the makeup test because it hasn't happened, and we don't know which test it is they're going to use. We have suspicions, but that's not something we predict because the numbers of people who take that test are relatively low.
Yeah, all we can say about that test in terms of predicting is what they won't use, which is the content we're going to discuss today, which is why we're obviously free and clear to do this now, as opposed to having to wait for the makeup too. And that's ultimately a good thing, I think. If the makeup used the same content from this week, that's too much of a lag for security purposes, I think. So sorry to anyone who's forced to take the makeup. You will get a different test than what you've seen so far and than what we covered today. You mentioned ProctorU, Dave, as being, it's never a perfect experience for everyone, but fairly seamless. It didn't seem like there was anything major that occurred, like we have seen, unfortunately, in the past. I bring it back up to note that this is ProctorU's last hurrah. Their last LSAT as the proctoring service. It's switching in August, as we have discussed before, to test centers, for one thing. But yeah, the group that's doing it escapes my memory. I'm sure you
Prometric.
know. Yeah, Prometric. There it is. It's tip of my tongue. I couldn't think of it.
Yeah, and they're handling both the online and in-person aspect of this. So, John, shed a tear, pour one out for ProctorU, or in my case, don't.
Yeah, I'm pouring nothing out for ProctorU.
Good riddance. I really didn't love the way they handled things. And it might be systemic the way that it's set up, but certainly there were too many instances of proctors doing things and saying things and acting in ways which were contrary to the best interests of the students. And that's my top priority, is making sure that the people taking the test are protected. And too many times misinformation being given out. No, you can't use Control F. Okay, that's false. No, you can't use scratch paper. That's false as well. So my best hope going forward is that Prometric has got better training and better employees than ProctorU did. Am I incredibly optimistic that that's the case? No. I'm not. I think the kind of like in-center employees will probably be better than the remote employees. But again, this is going to be a bit of a hit and miss at times, the same as it was with ProctorU. That's where my money is, at least on how things will turn out.
Yeah, my money's in the same spot, unfortunately. I don't think we're moving from an imperfect experience to a perfect one. I just hope this is less imperfect.
Yeah, it's moving from one experience to a different experience. And, the phrase that I've heard more than once is the devil you know.
Right.
We knew what ProctorU was. We knew how to navigate that system. We knew what the best advice was. I'm hoping that the problems that we see going forward, because they are inevitable in a system of this size with this many moving parts, I'm just hoping that the problems that we see aren't new and uniquely pernicious and problematic. That is, I want things that are easier to solve as opposed to harder to solve. So, fingers crossed.
Time will tell. All right. I know as we get into this and start talking test content that you, now somewhat infamously, have a series of disclaimers that you tend to run through. It's become too traditional, I think, at this point for you to do it, for me to try to step in. So, I mean, it's the bed you've made. That's my excuse.
The worst lie you've told.
Dave, we don't want to break with this incredibly valuable tradition.
This tradition must
you having
be
to read the next
of
10
you doing
minutes
this whole section.
That's right.
Yeah. Why do I always have these kind of generic parts to deal with? Yes, I should make you do it, but I will not, out of a sympathy for the fact that I could do it in my sleep and probably do.
Thank you. Yeah, so I have to remind myself of some of these.
Indeed. As we get into this discussion of the test content, there's always a series of disclaimers. I'm going to try to make them fast this time because I think I'm at my wit's end with doing this. But for those of you who haven't heard them before, and actually for many of you who have heard them and forgotten them, let's go through this and talk a little bit about what it is that we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, some of the information, and how to frame the perspective on what it is you're going to hear. And the first thing, as well as the last thing, is we ask that you not summarize this online. I watch summaries come out all the time, and it really irritates me because I see them missing the nuance of what we're saying. And there is nuance in this test, just like every other LSAT. It's a free podcast. Just tell people to come hear it from us directly. They could skip right to the timestamp where we start talking about it. I just would rather they hear us talk about it than a several word summary. Another thing I'll remind people of is that your section order is now essentially meaningless. Just because you had the same section order as someone else doesn't mean you had the same test. I watched two people again, as almost every test talking, and I was like, there's no certainty here that you have the same test. And that is because the section content as well as the section orders change all day. You can take the test Friday morning, and then another person can take tests on Friday morning. You might not have the same test. So just be aware of that. When we talk about information that has been disclosed publicly, especially once the test is ending on Tuesday, LSAC allows you to talk about generalities, the topic of certain questions. What was this game about? What they don't want and what we support and what we would never ask for is specifics and solutions and answers and rule wordings and question wordings and what have you. So that's one of those situations where if you see it floating around, that's not something we're interested in. We're only interested in the topics. LSAC has decided that that's an allowable thing just because they know people are people. But they do want you to wait until the main testing days are over, and they really don't want you talking about it publicly. So the other thing I'll say is that a lot of this is based upon what we hear from specific students. So if we haven't heard from a person who had, a very small administration or exam version, and that person was one of a few who got it, well, we can't make predictions about it. That is something that affects us a little bit more with international test takers. I think we have a good handle on the international test today, but sometimes we just don't get enough information. It also means that sometimes you may not hear your sections discussed below. That could have been because you had a version that didn't have a huge number of test takers with it, and it wasn't given to us. When we talk about our kind of ratings and viability of each section in terms of difficulty, I will remind everybody that taking the LSAT for real always feels worse than taking a practice test. It's just not the same thing. The pressure's not the same. The tension's not the same. And because of that, there is a very strong negativity bias that creeps into an individual's recollections of the exam. I've seen people go out and destroy this test and come back and tell me it was the worst experience, the worst LSAT they've ever had. And then they're happily surprised when they get their score back. It doesn't happen for everybody, but it is a great example of how even the best test takers sometimes feel like that killed me. That's because it's real and you know that it counts. It goes on the so-called permanent record. Speaking of easier or harder or difficulty, when we say something is easy or easier, it's relative. I am a true believer that all sections on the LSAT are challenging. They're all hard. So everything we're talking about is already at a baseline threshold difficulty that is very high. So if it's easier, it's just not the hardest of hard. And when we say it's harder, it means it probably is extremely hard overall. But keep that in mind. Easier does not mean easy. It still means hard, just on the easier side of hard up there. Also keep in mind that the test makers are actively attempting to confuse you by placing the same topics in multiple sections. They love to do this, especially with reading comprehension. Didn't see it as much on this test, although there were a few examples, saw electromagnetics in 2 LR sections that some people had. It's the kind of thing that can be very confusing when it's floating around. This is a known tactic they use to make people confused when they're talking after the test. When they say, oh, I had the passage about Nigeria, and someone else says, oh, I had the passage about Nigeria, but they're not exactly the same passage. Also, our estimations of what are real and experimental are based on certain assumptions about reusages, namely that if you had a prior scored section, it will almost never be an experimental section unless there's something weird going on. So that's not something that we're going to worry about. If we know it was used as real before, we're going to think that it's real again this time, and that track record has held good for us so far going through this. Second to last point, one more time, you may not hear your section discussed, or you may not recall the questions that we mentioned. That does happen. For a lot of people, they come out of the test and there's a blurring effect. Feels like they just went through something at high speed, like they scrolled right through it really fast. They don't remember a whole lot. That is normal. And sometimes there are individual sections that are administered in such small numbers that we never hear about them. So if we don't hear about it, there's no way for us to cross-reference this into our database. And that is another point. A lot of the information that we get, we don't take it at face value. We assemble all the data, and then what Jon and I do afterwards is after we're confident we have a pretty good picture of the test, we then run it into our database and cross-reference what we know in the past. This helps us to make sure that we're not making biased kind of predictions. It also allows us to see if they change questions in a section, which has happened before in the past. And then the last point, once again, please do not summarize this online. It misses the nuance. Just send them right to the timestamp of where it is that we are. And on that note, Jon, we can get to the international LSAT
Yes, sir.
that was administered.
Nicely done, as always. Sorry to put all that load on you. Let's talk about the international test, because this was a fairly big one, I know, for people overseas. And let's see where to begin. I mean, this is one that we never really try to predict. A lot of people in the crystal balls ask about these international tests if we're going to make predictions there. And we rarely do, aside from the general conceptual predictions that we make. We really talk about topics or tests for internationals because it's just, again, it's scattered and it's harder to do. But here, if you were listening to the crystal ball, I think you would have gotten some pretty good, useful insights, as we will discuss.
Yeah, and are you going to... now you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say where to begin. I think the thing we saw the most of was logic games, because there were two different logic games sections. So two real scored logic game sections. So let's start with the scored content in logic games. And then we'll run it from there through reading comp and through logical reasoning. And here's what we saw or have heard back from international people in the last day or so. One section of games that was used comes from the January 2019 LSAT. 23 questions. These were the real topics. So if you happen to see these games on your international test and had two sets of games, which we didn't see, I don't think, you would know this was the scored section. 7 computer installations. There's a game in there about different color statues and pillars. Their order from shortest to tallest. Some people call this art commissions. A game in there about 2 branches of a bank corporation, East and West, with 3 departments, investments, loans, and mortgages, something we've seen them do plenty of times. And then finally a game that was, I know, tricky for a little bit of people, which was a building with 9 apartments scattered over 3 floors. And the apartments were of different types, luxury, modern, and traditional. And you had to figure out that particular arrangement. Not the easiest section in the world, although I think for most people, there weren't any huge surprises in this section. Let me put it that way. There wasn't some weird circular game or some pattern thing to sort out. But this was one where I think all 4 games presented some challenge. So that's a tricky thing to deal with.
Yeah, especially that second and fourth games.
Yeah, statues or pillars in the apartment buildings. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think the third one was easy. Maybe the first one is the easiest out of there, but this is a challenging section. And it's interesting because in this international test, you don't always see 2 scored logic game sections. Sometimes they just give the same test all day. So I know you and I were a little surprised.
Yeah, it was.
That particular question, this whole section comes from January 2019. So our immediate thought was, hey, they're going to use the whole January 2019 LSAT. So when you had the second logic game section pop up, I think it was a surprise. If I'm guessing here, I think more people would have had the section we just talked about.
I think so too.
From a numbers standpoint. But that means there was another section that was floating around. Do you want to cover that, or do you want me to cover it?
No, I'm happy to do it. The other real section of games that we've heard from people overseas actually comes from a test a little bit closer to present, which was October 2020. It's been reused, or we've seen it come up since. I think there was a section of this on the March 2022 LSAT. But we know these were the games. We know them pretty well, actually, at this point. 23 questions in this section. These were the games. It was a game about concerts and bands, opening and main acts. There was a game about job interviews and the candidates for that. A game about a bookstore and book signings. And then, perhaps most alarmingly for people, was a game about operating machines in a factory. Kind of a classic game that we've discussed before. Riveter, press, and shredder were the machines being operated there. This was a tricky game, full stop. Everyone I've heard talk about this game has said it was pretty tricky, pretty hard.
Yeah, this is a weird section because the first 3 games are not at the highest level of difficulty, but then the last one is.
Yeah.
And this is a game that has been tested repeatedly. John, when we go back and we take a look at this, we can see uses of it as an experimental in 2008, 2011, 2013, and 2014. And then it kind of disappeared for a while, and then it starts coming back for real in the last few years. So this is one that they really worked on to kind of bring it out. And the reason I mention that is we recently did a podcast on kind of like the history of a single reading comp section. This is exactly the kind of section that you could do for logic games, where you'd be like, look how many times they worked through this before they said it's final and it's actually ready to go. But we'll talk about the scaling on this in just a few minutes, because I think the scaling on these 2 games is interesting.
Let's get through reading comp and LR first, and then we'll do the typical matrix that we do for the international folks. Only saw 1 scored section of reading comp, which means it's possible there's another one out there and we just didn't hear about it. So if this doesn't match your reading comp experience, it's a shame we didn't hear from you, because we would have certainly mentioned yours. Here's what we know, though. 1 real section that we have seen, 27 questions, also from that January 2019 LSAT, which was where the first set of games came from that I mentioned. These were the 4 passages. It started with a passage about playwrights and plays being adapted in a foreign context. This had Ethel Fugard and Michel Tremblay I'm butchering both of those, I'm sure. But sort of South African and East German and Quebec and Scotland and various international influences here that passage talked about. The second passage, one that I find really interesting and would like to read, is about Pueblo Indian rock inscriptions, whether they were made as art due to the Crab Nebula explosion or supernova that occurred. So again, a passage about indigenous peoples and kind of what they're up to, in this case, their art. The third passage was about placebo drug research, mentioned things like acupuncture and IBS, and then it ended with what I imagine is stultifying passage on copyright and trademark law, which was also a tough passage. One Dave would appreciate more than me, I think.
Yeah, it's funny because the copyright trademark, I would really, really enjoy reading that. But I also would enjoy that kind of like the rock inscriptions. John, I don't think you know this. I used to live out in the desert when I was a kid on a Navy base, and there were a really large amount of rock inscriptions from the natives that were thousands of years old. So that every once in a while, they'd take us up there, like school trip or something like that, and see them. They were really very cool.
That's very cool.
So I wouldn't mind reading that passage at all, although maybe you want to read it more. I don't know.
I don't want to read any of them, if you want the real truth. But if I had to read one of those four, it's the Indian art for me. But yeah, another medium hard section of reading comp. You really don't get any big breaks with reading comp these days. This one was definitely tricky, and people, I think justifiably on some level, had some gripes. But that's the only passage set that we saw internationally. And then logical reasoning. Again, we're seeing a couple of different sections potentially, but they all seem to at least have their home base or their origin story from January 2019 as well. So that test is clearly getting most of the love here. Let me do this, Dave, and this is a little bit unusual. Let me read passages, LR topics that we know were on that January 2019 test. Even if they didn't get used internationally or we're not certain, if you hear one of these topics, that section for you would have been scored. And given that most internationals that I talked to had double LR, I think this is a moment of real clarity or clarification that people are looking for. Yeah, hopefully. So here is one real section of LR that we feel very confident about. This is from January 2019. I'm not sure how many questions, likely 26, but don't quote me on that. This had topics about SUV headlights. It had free radicals. It had the bailout of a company. It had diamond mining and the value of diamonds. There was a question in there about teacher shortages, about being a kind person and kindness. A question a lot of people talked about sensationalist cancer statistics and sort of the doctor versus the media view on how cancer statistics were being reported. A question about Factor 22, park ranger and cows grazing, devaluing currency, another question a lot of people talked about, and then a question on Marie Antoinette. And I assume this is probably the let them eat cake misattributed quote for her. But that was another question that a lot of people seem to remember pretty clearly, Marie Antoinette. If any of those rings a bell, we know that section was real for you.
I think everybody I talked to had this section.
I think me too. Yeah, as at least one of their two.
Yeah, and so that was from the January 2019 LSAT. We know that they used the RC and the logic games from that. It all lines up that is going to be the section that's scored there. So hopefully that kind of, if you had that section, it rings that bell.
And hopefully that covers everybody. But just on the off chance that it doesn't, and we know January 2019 is the main test that's being used here, let me read just a couple of topics from the other section we know was scored in January 2019. If you had these, again, they should count as scored.
Yeah. And let me add this in before you say that, John, because in January 2019, there were 2 scored logical reasoning. That was back when the test had 2 scored LR. So this was the other section. They could have used it. They sometimes do this interchangeably. So
yeah,
sorry for interrupting.
No, that's a good point. This is predates the flex and the 1 LR that we currently have. So that's why, there were 2 scored sections back then. Here's some topics. Burglary and percentage of homes that get broken into with alarm systems, locomotive steam engines, porpoises. There's a question there about resident doctors shortening their hours, or their hours being shortened. There's a question about a lie detector test, a question about seatbelt usage, and then maybe the most talked about question in this section about a colorful stone axe. Certainly a lot of people would remember that one if they had it.
Yeah. And I didn't have anyone talk to me about that
Me
question or
neither.
this section, so I'm not sure it was used, but it is entirely possible that that is the case. And once again, with international test takers, especially if they've taken other prior tests and they weren't international, sometimes there's a few people who get a different version. But this appears to have been the main version that was actually used. So on that basis, let's go down and talk about the scoring matrix for the international test.
All right.
John, since you just did all the lifting on the question coverage, I'll pick this part up.
Thank you.
And let's talk about what it is that we're trying to do here. We're trying to predict how many questions you can miss to get certain scores. And in this case, we focus on the scoring of 170 because it is easier for us to see high-level difficulty in this test. It is much harder for us to see mid-level difficulty. So we're looking at how many questions you can miss to get a 170. And we start by saying, based upon kind of like historical numbers, some calculations we've made, that you could miss 7 questions on the average section for a 170. And then what I'll do is I'll talk about each of the sections that John just covered, and we'll see whether or not that keeps that 7 the same for the whole test, whether it tightens it, maybe goes to 6, or maybe it loosens it and takes it to 8, or maybe there's some nuance in there because so often there is some nuance. So let's start off by saying you're a test taker, thinking to yourself to get a 170, you can miss 7 questions. Your Logic Games was the one from January 2019 about computer installations, the statues and pillars, the East-West Bank branches, and the apartments, luxury, and so forth. If you had that section, when this has come up before, we have said that this section was hard enough to loosen your test by 1, to move you from 7 to 8. So if you're that person, you just got a looser scale to actually deal with. Now, let's say you had the other section that we saw. Starts with the interviews, then the concert with the opening and main acts, the authors and the books, and then the machine, the press, shredder, and riveter. This one, we've talked about this in the past, and it always annoys people. This is not going to move your section a whole point. And the reason is this. The first 3 games are livable. The last game is definitely brutal. The way I look at this is that if you're at the 170 level, they expect you to do well in this section. However, it will move the scale as you come down into the 160s. So I'm going to call this a 0.5. So if you're that person, you'd have to ask yourself, how am I scoring? Am I a 175 score? Then you don't get a break for having this Logic Game section. If you're a 160 score, yeah, you do get a break. Then you could add 1. That's what we mean when we say 0.5. So everybody's either at that 0.5 mark or they're at 7.5 mark or they're at the 8 mark right there. That RC is something we've seen a lot. That is a tough RC section. Is it the toughest ever? No, but it's hard enough to move the scale. That would take everybody 1 more notch. So everyone would go to either 8.5 or 9 that you could miss to get a 170. And then no matter what your LR was, it did not move the scale. So everyone ends up being 8.5 or 9. And those 8.5 people have to ask themselves, where are they scoring? Because they could be 9, they might be 8, especially if they're in the 170s. So that is the rundown on the international test right there. And hopefully that covers everybody. And if it doesn't, if you're like, I didn't have that, send us a message. Let us know what you did have so that we can actually add it to our files and make sure that we know it was used this time around. We usually don't get those messages afterward, which I take as a good sign. But every once in a blue moon, it happens. So if you're that person, let us know. And that's the international LSAT, John.
Fair enough. Let's take things a little closer to home. Let's move domestic.
Yes, and one of the things I'll get out of the way immediately is the paper and pencil test that was given today. The content appears to have mirrored the content that we saw over the weekend, and so your conversation, your understanding of the test should be kind of rolled into our regular conversation that we're about to have about the domestic test. So paper and pencil now part of the domestic grouping, and we'll talk about that right now.
So with this domestic test, what we usually do is we start with a little self-evaluation, typically, which is to say, how did we do with the crystal ball? In this case, how did we do with the mini ball that we kind of did just for this June test? Let's give ourselves a grade, basically, on our predictions. And I'm happy to report we remain straight A students. This was another one of those predictions where I'd say we pretty much nailed it. This wasn't the most, I thought, likely test for them to reuse. I know I'm being a little cryptic about the test. I'll mention it in a second. But it is one of the ones that we talked about at some length in that mini ball. And certainly when you look at like the predicted RC topics, which was a slide screen I put up, every single one of the passages that people, at least on Friday for this predicted version, got mentioned as part of those topics and topic sets. A lot of the games did too. Certainly LR held to the trends that we've been seeing. And some of the question types that I mentioned might surprise you with their frequency did indeed appear quite a bit. So I feel really good about this one. We may not have gotten the test exactly right, but we got the content exactly right.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and there's a little bit of nuance to that. The idea is we're going to look at a set of tests that are the most likely, and when we make our predicted problem sets and topics that we think are coming up, we use all of those tests to kind of assemble that profile. So even if we're close to the target, it still then helps people who are using those materials because we would have included it. It's not like this is the actual one test they're going to use and that's the only thing we're going to like prepare people for. That would be foolish and short-sighted. And hopefully, John, you and I will never be described as either. Well, foolish, but hopefully not short-sighted. And so we're actually able to put that in play. And so immediately when we started throwing around comments about, well, you know, I saw these topics before and that's what it refers to. Yeah. So this might not have been the most likely test, but we felt that there was a very reasonable chance that some of the content from it would appear, and it did. Yeah. So this is a win overall.
Yeah. And again, you mentioned before, a lot of the people that we were hearing back from, especially on Friday, were like, oh my God, all 4 of the topics in my reading comp, you guys told me, which is pretty remarkable when you stop and think about it. And the comment you've made many times before is this won't last. We're not going to be able to do this forever. But man, while the getting's good, it's really good.
It really is. These are halcyon days. This is the golden age. I've said that, and I really, truly believe it. And the longer it lasts, the better I feel just about life in general. And I do know it's ending at some point. This ability to predict this the way we're doing is not going to last. But hey, while the sun shines, you know, make hay. Hey. And that's exactly what's happening right here. So let's dive in. John, I'll cover the logic games that we saw overall, if that's cool with you, and then I'll let you hit the RC.
Yeah, that's
perfect. Fair?
Yep. And this will be the first big reveal, so to speak, of the main test that was in use for people over the last few days.
Yeah. And that test was from October of 2021. And so very nicely, some of the things they did in games, I had talked about a little bit like structurally in the mini ball. You'll hear John talk about some of the topics when we get to RC. But this was, and I think for everybody, there were only 2 logic game sections that were used throughout the weekend. There was no experimental logic game administered that we saw. And again, if you had that, you didn't let us know, please let us know afterwards. So as we've been predicting, they're using fewer and fewer logic game experimentals, and that is because of the expected change in the middle of next year to a different type of logic game / analytical reasoning section. So they don't need as many at this point. But using that October 2021 LSAT, again, this section had 23 questions, and it starts off with a photographer who's taking pictures, photographing politicians. You've got 7 people arriving in a city, or maybe it's a country, over 5 days. Then you've got suspects indicted in a fraud case. It's kind of an interesting scenario there. And then finally, that game about the fraud is hard, and then the game at the end is probably even harder, certainly because it comes at the end as well, but tough overall. About 6 musicians, violinists, pianists, auditioning in duets for things like folk, jazz, and gospel. And that is not the easiest section in the world, I guess would be the simple way for me to actually put that. That is a tough one overall. But that was the first section that we saw that triggered us to think that October 2021 content was probably going to be used a lot, and it was. Now, the other section that we saw kind of appear is an interesting one. There's not a direct full section specific precursor to this. I've seen some of these games previously, though, specifically this first one about there was 23 questions and there was 5 advertisements, whether they were in print or television or perhaps neither. Then there was another game about discovering, or archaeologists discovering abandoned cities. kind of like 8 of them there. Third game was about scholars, student scholars giving speeches over a period of time in an afternoon every hour. And then lastly, a news show scheduling and adding in new shows every night. And kind of like going from a Monday to Thursday type of schedule. This was probably the trickiest game of them all, but this wasn't as hard as the other section. And we saw this a little bit more, I think, on Saturday than we saw it on Friday.
That's right.
Isn't to say it wasn't used on Friday. It's just the first section was more dominant on Friday. This section appeared to be more dominant on Saturday. But we'll come back to the scaling of those 2 sections in a few minutes, but both of those were real. Saw tons of people with one or the other there, obviously. And then that takes us to reading comp, where we do start to see experimental sections. So it gets more interesting. So I gave you the interesting part, Jon.
Thank you. You also gave me the 50% more part because there were 2 real RCs as well, but also an experimental section. So I'm going to mention all 12 of the passages that we saw over the course of the weekend. And I'll start with a real section also from October 2021, 27 questions. And this is the one that we predicted more or less to the letter. There were passages here on the Mali Empire. There were passages on, second passage I believe was on like paleo and hominids and biological adaptation and evolution. Third passage, Ms. Alice Munro and the short stories that she wrote for Dear Life. That was the comparative passage in this particular section. And then it ended with a passage on paternalism of the state, privacy laws, and John Stuart Mill, a really tough passage by all reports. And a hard section overall. Although I will say made easier a bit, hopefully, by the fact that all 4 of those things were things I told people in the crystal ball or the mini ball to go read up on. I said, go read about the Mali Empire and the establishment of like democracy or something. Go read up on Alice Munro, know who she is, know a little bit about her backstory. If you don't know who John Stuart Mill is or what this paternalism of the state idea related to him is, you can go actually research that a little bit. And get some context and familiarity. So if you're hit with a passage on that, at least it doesn't strike you as something entirely foreign. And that was the goal. I think we achieved it. I know a lot of people were grateful for those predictions.
Yeah, and I would say, Jon, that, here a lot of times I see these legal passages and think that would be fascinating to read. Not this one.
Not so much here? Okay.
I don't have any interest in the paternalism of the state. They can go throw that in a lake, man.
Well, given that it was probably the hardest passage in that section, you picked a good one to toss. There was another section, though, in reading comp that was real. And again, kind of like games, we saw this second section appearing more on Saturday than on Friday. Most of the Friday people were treated to the October 2021 games and reading comp. The real passages we saw a little later in the weekend, more predominantly at least, were about a CITES treaties. Am I saying that right? CITES. I assume
that's probably a shorthand for it.
Say the full acronym as opposed to each letter. Treaties to protect endangered species and essentially how they failed. So pretty critical passage there. There was a passage on skepticism and Descartes, which is dense. Passage on Native American archaeology, something that the international test people saw as well. Different passages, of course, similar topics. That was the comparative passage. And then a passage on eukaryotes and prokaryotes. This was a cell biology passage, basically, and theories for their development. Also dense. So if you saw this section of real passages, it was scored. It was also quite difficult. I think in line, difficulty-wise, probably with the Mali, Alice Munro paternalism section that I just mentioned.
Yeah, this wasn't an easy section at all, and I think you can really see it in the second and the fourth passages. Neither one of them strikes me as fun to read. It's not that I'm not familiar with Descartes or skepticism, but seeing that type of topic on reading comprehension, my radar would have been going off like crazy. Like, this is going to probably be hard because there's a lot of kind of like little side trips they can take inside that discussion that could be really problematic. And the same thing here with the biology. I'm sure you, with your science background, is like, oh, I crushed that. For me, I'd be like, all right, this is going to be an uphill climb. Let's fight our way through it.
Yeah, I would have found the psychology or the philosophy aspects of the Descartes passage, I think, a little more tedious than the eukaryote-prokaryote discussion, which I would have presumably been pretty familiar to me. But it just goes to show how familiarity does make a difference. We get asked a lot with these predictions as to, like, what's the point? Who cares if you know Alice Munro is coming? You still don't know the passage. And that's true. But you can know a little bit about the topic or the source, and that can be extremely beneficial psychologically, if nothing else.
Faster uptake. You don't have to adjust as quickly because you already know a little bit of the lay of the land, and then you just have to see what they say inside that structure that you've already built for yourself. All right, so both of those were scored sections, both of them challenging, as so many reading comp sections have been recently. There was an experimental section floating around that we saw a lot of.
Yeah, no surprise. We didn't get experimental games, which was pretty to be expected. We did get experimental reading comp, also to be expected. And for a lot of people, especially on Friday, this seemed to be their experimental section. There were a lot of double RCs on Friday. Here are the 4 passages from the experimental. These do not count. The first passage, I believe, was about AI, artificial intelligent optimists versus pragmatists. Pretty topical thing these days. There was a passage in there about magnoreceptivity in whales, which, again, had to do with echolocation and things. A topic we've seen come up before in the way that it dealt, I believe, with like astronauts or something. There was one pretty recently that dealt with like echolocation and sensors and radar and stuff. I may be conflating that with a different topic, but this has come up recently a couple of times.
Now, there's somebody who's an expert on this because I've seen it with dolphins, or somebody has an interest in it who writes questions for them. So this is one of these areas that they mine. We said this before, is you can see threads throughout history of people writing questions where they're like, I know a lot about this topic, and they write different versions of it. Think about bee waggle dances in RC or serotonin and some of these old school kind of things where it's like there's been multiple passages on the same topic. Think about how many times dinosaurs come up.
Oh, God.
They come up way more in logical reasoning than they come up in any other place in my life. So it's like one of those things like, all right, I know there's a couple dinosaur experts. They write a lot of questions. They're interesting questions. I like them much better than the ones about like free will and the public good and all that stuff that I don't like as much.
Yeah, they've clearly got a dolphin expert somewhere in the basement, and they keep churning these passages out. So those were the first 2, AI and then whales. The third and the fourth. The third passage was about legal challenges of dealing with space junk and debris. That was the comparative passage. So all 3 of these sections had the comparative passage third, I believe. And then finally, it ended with a passage on Cuban author Alejo Carpentier's work on the libretto for a 1927 ballet El Milagro, which, again, I'm struggling with pronunciations and butchering names back and forth.
You made them both Spanish and French. That's what I really like.
Carpentier. Carpentier. I don't know. Well, he's Cuban, so you know it's a mixed culture down there. You never know.
Yeah, and I think that passage had Afro-Cubanismo in it as well, but that's kind of an interesting kind of topic there. The libretto, kind of like the music and everything for the ballet. So that's one of those ones where I think I would just like to see it, to read it. The whales one sounds interesting. The space junk one sounds great. The AI sounds pretty good. This sounds like a lineup of topics that I could get behind and enjoy thoroughly all the way through. So of course it didn't count.
Yeah, of course. And we've seen that trend, actually. Anything that looked interesting was more likely to be experimental on the past several years' worth of RC, which is a bummer, whether it's the Twilight references or the Golden Girls or some of the other sort of topical things. Outcast, the band.
Outcast was one.
All
just looking at that recently.
All experimental, regrettably. And then
the future students, they'll have it good.
Yeah, I mean, there should be a light at the end of this for a lot of people, some sort of like hope, because if they're testing it as experimental now, you can pretty much guarantee that in a 2-year period or so, you're going to see this as real. And there's some fun experimental passages that I can't wait to see pop back up.
Excellent. So let's get to the logical reasoning sections then. And as become our kind of habitual approach to this, in order to reduce the amount of confusion, we're not going to cover the experimental sections. Got a fair amount of data on them, but what we've discovered is when we cover the real and then the experimental, for a lot of people, there's so many questions. If they had 2 LR, what they end up running into is, I can't remember which one was which.
Yeah.
So it was suggested to us, and I think it was a good suggestion, that what we do is just cover the real questions. And that way, if somebody's like, that was my second section or that was my first section, it'll make it easier and it'll keep out all the kind of like the chaff that is causing confusion. So let's talk about the first real scored section that we saw. And yes, indeed, it was from that October 2021 LSAT. It was 25 questions, if I recall correctly. Here's some of the topics on this particular section. Allelopathic plants, which are plants that give off a chemical to deter predation in some way or other plants from moving in. Scrub jays, been a lot of that in recent years, speaking of kind of like threads of expertise and how they behave when food is plentiful and what happens in cities versus rural areas. A question about fluency in foreign language and what happens when you're a study abroad student and how it develops more or less depending upon these things. A question that sounds really cool to me that we've seen on experimentals before about Mount Vesuvius in Pompeii and its eruption and how it preserves graffiti in a building side. A question about architects. I think it was an architect convention and they're visiting a city. And of course, what do architects do? They admire buildings. So we have that. One about lightning and homeowner policies in Britain in 2005. A question about monorail policy and commuters and its effect on congestion. I think if I recall correctly, the point is that people don't all use buses already, so why are they going to use the monorail? It's not going to help. And then a political candidate making misstatements and the reporting around those particular misstatements. Those were, to my understanding, all in the same section. This was overall a fairly reasonable section. That was scored. That was a real section if you had that.
Yeah.
All right.
Nicely done. Nicely done. We did have one other section of real LR to go along with it. And this was new. So this, kind of like that other section of games, doesn't have anything where we can like predate it or see some sort of like origin. Certainly these have been tested in experimental sections previously, but to track them all down, we don't have like a single test where they come from. So here are the new real LR topics that we saw. It was a question about collars on bears, question about Pueblo pottery and cacao, I think. Political candidate, a lot of political questions in these. Political candidate who cherry picks scientific facts to support his agenda. Topical. Political candidates not being allowed to list anything related to their slogans on the ballot. For instance, I think this was the one about a candidate whose first name or nickname was Papa, and they couldn't use that as part of their political sloganing or branding. Question on honeydew, on non-specialists finding new species, a question about being homesick and using technology to talk to friends and family. That was early. It might have been the first question in this section. And then a question on tourists and national parks. Pretty standard stuff there topically, but those were the section questions and the other real scored section of LR.
All right. And that's really all that we saw. Again, could there be variations on those themes and someone had a different scored LR? Yeah, because there were 17,000 people who took this test. If you've seen some of these sections before, they are forced to give you a different section. That could be a really small population where you see that type of variation. This would cover the majority of people that are out there. But if you didn't have either of these sections, let us know. Because that way we can just add it to the super archive that we keep about every single LSAT, and that just helps us get more and more accurate over time. It's a learning machine in terms of what we're doing, and every bit helps, to be quite honest about it.
Definitely.
But
so yeah, what is that? Six then scored sections, 2 of each type.
Yep, that's exactly right. So really, primarily 8 scored variations were possible for this particular exam. And we've said this before, John, when they first started doing it, they had like 40 or 50 variations in some of these tests. It was an absolute nightmare to sort it all out. I remember hating life at that point. And now it's gotten to the point where it's a little bit easier. And we kept saying, you don't need this many variations. No one's going to be able to kind of crack the code on this and cheat with it. We're having trouble just keeping up. You can take it down a little bit. So there will be 8 main variations here. And again, it is possible that there were 1 or 2 additional sections in each that were just given to smaller groups. So let's go to the matrix. And again, in case you skipped over that international discussion, what we start with is you can miss 7 questions, and that would give you a score of 170. And then we'll go through each one of these kind of sections, games, reading comp, LR, and then that will adjust your scale. Might loosen it, might tighten it, might have no effect. I'll explain as we kind of go through it. But that 7 is that you miss 7 questions. That's what you have to stay in the 170s. And I will note that when John and I talk about this, we are often on the conservative side because that benefits the student. If we're wrong and it is actually better, your score ends up being higher than expected as opposed to lower than expected. So this is by design. It is to protect people from getting the most accurate take and really the least optimistic take, one might actually say.
Yeah, I'm
That's
glad
what
you
you
mentioned
want.
that about the conservativeness, because definitely we tend to, if we're going to err or lean, we definitely lean to a tighter scale. And again, for the reasons you just mentioned.
Exactly. So let's go into the logic games and talk about the two sections that we saw. The first one was the photographers, people arriving in the city, the fraud suspects and the indictments, and then the last game being the musicians, the duets between violinists, pianists, and things like jazz and so forth. This is a hard section. This is actually going to loosen your scale by 1. So if you started off at 7 and you had this section, celebrate, you're now at -8. You can miss 8 questions to get a 170. The other section, this was the new section that starts off with ads in the print or TV or neither, scholars giving speeches, the new show schedule on Monday through Thursday at the very end. This is not going to change the schedule or the actual
Scaling.
the scaling. Yeah, it's going to stay at 0. And John, to be quite honest with you, I think this probably tightens it by a half point.
I fear the same. Sorry, I was up.
Yeah.
Vodka tonic sip.
What?
I was letting you coast here. I'm
take
just
a
sitting
minute.
back drinking like a fish.
You're like, yeah, I'm enjoying myself.
I didn't know
yeah.
I was going to be involved in this. But
My
yeah,
very
I fear the same thing, unfortunately, that this could actually take it to like a 6.5. Because it was, again, you make this point in the disclaimers. I'll reiterate it. When we say something is quote unquote easy, what we mean is relative, obviously, to what we saw. This was an easier section than the other one. Probably easy to the point that it could indeed tighten the scale. I don't think it's going to, but I see your point.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree, but I think probably anyone who did this section, a lot of the comments that I saw, and certainly the history that we have on it was standard, reasonable, not bad. That's the kind of sign where everybody's doing fairly well on a section. You don't see it loosening the scale. To stay at 7 is possible. I think it probably tightens it by a half. So everybody walks out of there. I'll just use my numbers here. Either you can miss 8 or it's that 6.5 scenario, which for the high scores would be 6, as you move down into the 160s. And so you'd get an extra point and move it to 7. So again, analyze where you are on the scale as to see that particular impact. Let's go to RC. Kind of good news for everybody here. Both of these sections were tough. They are going to loosen the scale no matter what's going on. So if you had the Mali Empire, the Paleo Hominids, Alice Munro, the Paternalism passage with John Mill that I never want to read, that is going to loosen your scale. That one's tough. And then the Sites Treatise, and then the Skepticism and Descartes, also I don't want to read. The Native American Archaeology, the Eukaryotes, equally difficult. Overall, that would loosen it. So some people are sitting here, they're at -9, and other people are at -7.5. I mean, you can miss 9 questions or the 7.5, that half floating, depending upon where you're scoring. And I explain that more in the international scale discussion. That leads us down to LR, and what we'll find here is for both of those LR sections, there's not going to be any movement. LR so often in the middle. This is another great example of that. So if you had the allelopathic plants, the scrub jays, the monorail, the architect convention, lightning, British homeowners, and so forth, that does not move the scale one way or the other. So it stays where you were already. Same thing with the one about Pueblo pottery, honeydew, the political candidates, Papa, and cherry picking the data. That also keeps it where it is. And so ultimately, many people would have the 9 scaling, and then a bunch of people would have the 7.5 scaling as well, where it's either going to be 7 in the 170s and then 8 in the 160s or so. Depends on where you're scoring as to how that would affect you.
I think I think that's pretty fair, and pretty rock solid in terms of like binary outcomes here. You're either a 9 or a 7.5. End of story, basically. And I take your point, Dave, about those games maybe tightening it up in the 170s only. Again, this is the nuance that is part of this discussion that's really hard to convey in like a Reddit reply or some kind of like Twitter comment, because it's hard to understand that like 7.5 type of scaling outcome unless you've heard the backstory for why it is that we make that kind of prediction.
Yeah, I wish it was so easy that we could just say it's +1, 0, -1, but it's not that easy. We started off doing that, and then we realized this isn't the same. There were grades of difficulty that we had to account for. And that's why we started using the 0.5. But what that means is that the 0.5 basically says at the highest level, you're not going to be benefited by that section. But as you move down through the scale, there's enough difficulty that it does actually open it up. And I think that's probably the most reasonable way to do this. It's certainly the way we've essentially trademarked, copyrighted how we're doing it. And so that's kind of our approach to this.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So there you have it. Those are the domestic test results. You'll get your score on June 28th, early, 9 a.m. Eastern is when scores start to come out, provided you have a completed and approved writing sample on file. Don't forget to do that if you never have. I know June is the first test for a lot of people, so you guys may not have writing samples on file. Make sure you go and do that as soon as possible if you haven't already. And yes. Hopefully we just have a few weeks before some good news here.
Yeah, and that's no matter which test you take, whether it is the domestic, the paper and pencil, the international, even if you take the makeup test next week, you still get your score if you have all the boxes checked on Wednesday, June 28th at 9 a.m. And if you are going to take the August LSAT, and you may not know that yet, hopefully that's not something that happens, but if you are thinking you're going to take it, join us the next day. At 8 p.m. Eastern, and John and I will be running through the full-on crystal ball for the August and September LSATs. Should be interesting to go back to the full format after the little mini ball format that I enjoyed so much.
Really
shorter.
Stretch our legs a bit more this time. When he says next day, he means day after score release. So that'll be Thursday, June 29th at 8 p.m. Eastern. That's the crystal ball. Try to be there because there's no guarantee we're going to make that recording public afterwards.
Yes, and it's unlikely in my opinion.
Well, there you go.
But on that note, John, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment and a rating as well. And if you have questions for an upcoming episode or questions about the LSAT, the admissions process, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. And that is pretty much it. On behalf of John and myself, we hope you've enjoyed it. We hope this was useful. Stay safe out there, and we will talk to you again soon.